Coming up on this week's episode of Shadow Talk, we're covering a React2Shell vulnerability under attack from Chinese Nexus groups. CISA warns of an ongoing Brickstorm backdoor attack. ShadyPanda hackers weaponize millions of browsers. And Storm 0249 moves from mass phishing to precision EDR exploitation. I'm John Dilgen, the host of Shadow Talk. Joining us today is Corey Carter, a systems security engineer at ReliaQuest, a Florida native and former infantryman in the United States Marines. Corey holds a bachelor's degree in computer science with a specialization in information assurance. His experience as a detection researcher, security analyst, and threat hunter at ReliaQuest, combined with his military background, equips him with a unique perspective on cybersecurity challenges. Corey, welcome, and how are you doing today?
Hey, John, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for the thorough intro. It's great to be on the pod and looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you today. Later in the podcast, we'll be joined by Hayden to cover our latest report on Storm 0249. But jumping right into the news today, we have a React2Shell vulnerability that's under attack from Chinese Nexus groups. Two critical vulnerabilities in React, both with maximum CVSS scores of 10, expose a significant portion of cloud environments to remote code execution. The vulnerabilities stem from unsafe deserialization in React server components and impact downstream frameworks like Next.js. Exploitation requires only a crafted HTTP request and has already been observed in the wild, including by the Chinese Nexus threat groups. Corey, what are your thoughts on this latest story?
Probably to start, as you said, this one's easy to scan for, easy to exploit. So currently getting targeted by or getting reported on by the Chinese and North Korean, based entities. But I have a feeling many different APTs, maybe even script kiddies, are out there scanning and trying to exploit this at the current time. So the scale and the scope is quite large for this one. So if you're impacted at all, please update. And I thought also one of the kind of like side issues that arose because of this vulnerability actually impacted Cloudflare. They weren't impacted in a way that their React servers were vulnerable and that caused them downtime. They had good intentions. So what happened going back to December 5th, and people might be aware out there, I feel like when Cloudflare goes down, it kind of halts a lot of operations. So it's kind of like, oh, I remember on this day what I was doing when this happened. I couldn't log into work or whatever it might be. Anyways, Cloudflare by default is designed to inspect the first 128 kilobytes of an HTTP request body. Now, the problem is with this, adversaries are often going to pad HTTP requests with benign data to start. So they'll take up the first 128 kilobytes that gets inspected with benign data and then pack their malicious command or whatever it might be, the method of exploitation below that. So the WAF sees, oh, hey, this looks benign. I've only inspected the first 28 kilobytes, so that's all I can fit in my memory, and then passes it through to the server. The server receives it, and then it gets exploited. So what they were trying to do is, by default, Next.js applications, which is one of the vulnerable entities from this vulnerability, defaults to a size of 1 megabyte for their HTTP requests. So Cloudflare was trying to increase their limit from 128 kilobytes up to a megabyte, which is mega, by the way. That's huge. That's much more security from a WAF perspective, because you can see much more of the HTTP request body, limits the padding workaround. And whenever they did this, though, they ran into issues with some internal test tools. So they tried to disable those internal test tools, and it actually resulted in 500 errors, which are internal server errors being reported to users. So good intentions, it's just the execution of it didn't quite go their way. It only resulted in about 30 minutes of downtime overall. But for comparison, AWS WAF is default to only inspect the first 8 kilobytes of the HTTP request body. I think you can scale that up to 64 kilobytes, maybe with some added cost associated with it, but still, you're getting much more protection by that 1 megabyte capability versus your 8 kilobyte that you might see in other technologies. So good intentions, just the execution didn't quite go their way this time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about the effect it had on Cloudflare and ultimately the enhanced security they're trying to build around this. couple other points that I found interesting that I wanted to hone in on. You said the potential for impact here. Quite a few security researchers out there are comparing this to Log4j or Log4Shell, which I think many of us remember the significant impact from and how it was all hands on deck. So we'll see if it evolves into that, but it's certainly looking like it has that potential. And one of the other interesting things is just how fast those APTs were on it. So this vulnerability was disclosed on December 3rd. And within hours of that, intelligence teams had observed active exploitation attempts by Chinese nation state groups. And Corey, you had a really great call out with that pile-on effect that we'll likely see other APTs doing. And just as a reminder, that automated scanning and exploitation is one of the key factors that drives success of ransomware groups like Clop and Scattered Lapsus Hunters now with Salesforce and data exfiltration.
Yeah, definitely similarities for sure with Log4Shell. I feel like the scope of that was maybe a bit bigger, at least from what I remember. We were looking for pretty much any public facing entity that had the Log4j service associated with it. But yeah, I remember the callback URL. That was fun times early on in my threat hunting days. So hopping on with customers, helping them work through these issues. But yeah, talking about where your React server is going to be located, let's be real. It's probably not on-prem, right? You're probably going to have it in the cloud environment, or maybe in either EC2 or Kubernetes. I think if it is running in Kubernetes, there's more complexities involved with escaping the container that it's running in. But for something like an EC2, we need to think about what's the first thing they're going to do when they exploit the vulnerability, and then now they're on the EC2. The first thing they're probably going to do is go to that cloud metadata IP, the 169.254, 169.254, and extract creds. If you're GCP, probably going to extract service account credentials, AWS, IAM type credentials. And then from there, they're probably going to use like the AWS CLI to interact with your cloud platform externally. Let's see what I can pull down with these credentials. Can I get into S3? Can I spin up EC2s? So I've said it a few times in the past, but if you're hosting public facing infrastructure, one thing you should try to do is, all right, can I move all of this to its own AWS account potentially? So that way, worst case, someone does pop the account, like they can't pivot to like maybe you're hosting internal infrastructure in different AWS accounts or other aspects of your environment in AWS accounts. And what the benefit of that allows is you can really hone in on service control policies. The industry as a whole really needs to start moving towards infrastructure as code, right? So you have your code, maybe in GitHub, GitLab, you have a GitLab runner that updates the code via like something like Terraform. So with these service control policies, if you say, hey, in order for anything to be manipulated in my cloud infrastructure, it has to come from this very specific role. That is going to severely impact the capabilities of these threat actors, even if they get on these servers and they pop them. It's going to make pivoting harder. It's going to make pulling down secrets harder. It's going to make many different things harder, because you can say, hey, I know the only thing that should be updating, or the only credential that should be updating any of these services, is coming from Terraform or a GitLab runner. So yeah, definitely that's the direction I hope we, as an industry, we work towards, because ClickOps, allowing the ability for users to get in here and spin up EC2s kind of willy-nilly, it needs to go away. So if it can, move it to its own DMZ type AWS account and really enforce SCPs and try to manage it as much as possible through something like Terraform.
Those are great defense recommendation callouts. Moving on the news, CISA has issued a warning about ongoing intrusions, again by Chinese nation state actors targeting VMware vSphere environments with the sophisticated Brickstorm backdoor. These attacks primarily focus on government and IT sectors, enabling long-term stealth access through stolen credentials, rogue virtual machines, and encrypted communications. Corey, anything stand out to you about this attack?
Yeah, so with typical nation state actors, especially the Chinese, it seems like they like the low and slow approach, right? Like, I'm going to get in here. And in this case, they were actually in the environment for a year before they were identified. So that's a lot different than some of these groups out there that are snatch and grab type operations, or they get in, they deploy ransomware, like they rather get in there and then just snoop and let's see what happens. I'm very terrified the future in the event that we do go to some type of like conflict and there are like IT type repercussions, like what all might come down. But getting away from that a little bit, yeah, CISA highlighted how it started in the DMZ from a compromised web server. The method of compromise is unknown. And what they were able to do, though, is they extracted service account credentials from the web server and directly RDP'd to a domain controller. From there, they dumped credentials and then laterally moved to the vSphere server. So although the vSphere server was like their ultimate target, honestly, because it's a great place to hide for persistent purposes, plus you're probably going to be running some type of critical infrastructure, maybe like DCs or DNS servers, like something or something virtualized within vSphere. And oftentimes, like, people are a little scared to touch those servers, right? Like, you don't want to be responsible for taking down a cascade effect of other virtual machines running from within that server. So yeah, once they get on the vSphere server, you're going to have a hard time dealing with them. The main issue to me, though, was the ability for the threat actor to RDP from the DMZ to the DC with a service account. One, you should have firewall policies in place, right? Like, why are you allowing RDP originating from the DMZ anywhere else in the network? Two, what else you should be doing if you need to have a service account that is getting on to a web server in the DMZ, like create a specific role in Active Directory for your DMZ service accounts. Through GPO, you need to go find your domain controller OU and then add that role of all your DMZ service accounts to the deny logon through remote desktop services. So that way, even if they were popped, they couldn't use those same credentials to ultimately RDP and log on to a domain controller. So also, in closing on my side for this one, do a quick tabletop. I think sometimes we over process and over formalize a tabletop when really you could just throw an hour on with maybe the CISO, your senior network engineers, your senior system engineers, and your security engineers, and then go through like, hey, if a web server is compromised, what are the most likely targets? What are the most valuable targets? And then how would they get there? I think as you're walking through the process of them trying to achieve those objectives, you're going to find maybe controls that you can put in place. Oh, this firewall is misconfigured actually, or we haven't hardened it as much as it possibly could be, or we could put GPOs in there to restrict these entities from RDPing or moving through SMB, whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that you can use to harden your environment. If you just put an hour on some people's schedules and talk through a scenario, get some detections in there when you can't have controls in place. So that would be my recommendation for sure.
Those are some great callouts, and I really want to double down on the one that you mentioned around the service account abuse. In this case, 2 of the service accounts were compromised. And I want to highlight a stat we released in a report earlier this year where we found that 80% of the incidents we observed that led to ransomware deployment had a service account compromised in some fashion. And it really just shows how often these are overprivileged and underdefended as far as the analysis around them goes. Just really want to stress that point to our listeners out there. Finally, in the news, ShadyPanda, another Chinese-based threat group, has weaponized millions of browsers through malicious Chrome and Edge extensions, collecting sensitive user data and enabling remote code execution, or RCE. These extensions, which operated legitimately for years before being weaponized, highlight critical weaknesses in browser marketplace security and the importance of post-approval monitoring. 4.3 million Chrome and Edge browser users were likely compromised via browser extensions that masqueraded as legitimate tools. The attackers exploited the fact that the browser extension review occurs only when the extension is submitted to the marketplace and not when it's updated after the fact. And I thought a really interesting aspect of this attack was the evolution. So as mentioned, this took place over the course of years. And initially it started small and under the radar, where the Chinese APTs were testing these extensions through small changes. And they originally started by injecting tracking and affiliate codes into purchases made on platforms like Amazon and eBay to get a small kickback to them. Now, this is a minor change and likely to go under the radar and undetected to many of the users as they're just unaware it's taking place on the back end. However, once they use this information to understand how these extensions are reviewed, they later evolved it into information stealing capabilities as well as full backdoor capabilities. And I just thought it was very interesting to watch how they started small in a relatively undetected manner and evolved later on.
Yeah, good call out with the evolution there, right? It's like interesting how, okay, we start with eBay, let me make some little side money. Then you realize the potential capabilities, right? Like, oh, I could actually get this extension to run JavaScript code. And that's going to open the door for many different types of exploitation out there. And for those unaware, Google and Microsoft, they only actually verify that an extension is not malicious when it's first uploaded. They don't re-review it every time the extension's updated. Is that a gap? Absolutely, for sure. Because a lot of the times with these extensions that the adversaries own, they're going to let it bake. Maybe they come up with a really good extension. It's a productivity extension or whatever it may be. They'll let it get like hundreds of thousands of downloads. They'll let it get recommended by Google, highly rated, and then they decide to poison it, right? And then with this poisoned, that's going to cascade and impact all those users that downloaded it. So if you're a CISO out there, 2 recommendations for you, or even a member on the security team, if you're listening, bring this up to someone. Go to an allow list model when it comes to browser extensions. We need to have default extensions, sure, that everyone needs. Maybe something like uBlock Origin, stop ads or some tracking tokens as much as possible. But treat these like software requests. You need to put scrutiny on these extensions that users are downloading out there. And you can control this if Windows, maybe through GPO, if you're a Mac OS shop, use some device management solution like Jamf out there. And then the second thing you need to do is restrict users having the ability to save their passwords in the browser. While not directly called out in this report, we've seen it time and time again how info stealers make it onto a host. Maybe it's not their work computer, but info stealers make it on and then they dump their browser credentials and then those make it on the dark web. Especially if you don't have like mobile app management or mobile device management and you allow users to sign in to something like Okta from their personal device, like major red flags there. Because who knows if their grandma or their kids are using their computer and they do something they shouldn't, and then an info stealer makes it on and exfiltrates their personal credentials as well as their work credentials. That's going to open the door for many different types of threats out there. So get your teams a password management solution. It doesn't matter which one, LastPass, Delinea, many different ones out there, but enforce through GPO the ability to not store passwords within their browser. Like they need to type in their password every time they log in, or they need to log into their secrets manager and then copy the password from there to log in. Like it's much more secure and 2 relatively achievable things that you can do to greatly increase the security of your organization and decrease the likelihood of this browser extension attack.
Yeah, those are key recommendations here, as they would have likely completely stopped this attack in process for any organizations who had those implemented. I'm curious to our listeners, though, as we've talked a lot about Chinese APTs, I also want to highlight that we are calling out the evolution of Chinese APT activity in our 2026 prediction report, specifically around their exploitation of IoT persistence mechanisms. But I'm curious what our listeners think as they work to establish footholds in the United States, specifically against critical infrastructure. What types of attacks do you think might they leverage these footholds for in the future? You can leave us a comment on YouTube or your podcast platform, as well as send us an email to intel@shadowtalk.com.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Gray Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Joining us in the second half today is Hayden Evans, who is a cyber threat intelligence analyst here at ReliaQuest. He has experience in the F3 EAD lifecycle, analyzing adversaries' TTPs to operationalize this information. He has also experience with intrusion response, OSINT investigations, and offensive security. Welcome, Hayden. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, John. How are you doing?
Doing very good. Glad to have you here. And today we're highlighting ReliaQuest's latest report on Storm 0249, an evolving threat actor that has transitioned from mass phishing campaigns to sophisticated exploitation of trusted security processes like SentinelOne's Sentinel Agent Worker.exe. This report dives into their use of techniques like DLL sideloading, fileless execution, and domain spoofing to bypass defenses and establish persistent footholds within target environments. Opening up to you, Hayden, what is Storm 0249?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, especially with these, weird names that we have thrown around all the time. So Storm is essentially tracked as a developing threat cluster that does not have like nailed down attribution such as like a certain nation state or a certain country. But this actor in particular or group is a financially motivated initial access broker. So what those individuals are, so they actually sell access to other actors in a bidding format, commonly on like Russian speaking cybercriminal forums, could be like on Telegram or even, of course, like other forums as well. And it's really just your eBay for access. So there's a start price, a step price, a buy now price, and this could range from a few $100s to a few thousands of dollars. We actually talked about them a bit from our last year's threat report and compared the prices from the year prior to that current year. And prices have actually gone up across the board for them. And we actually saw that manufacturing was the top sector listed as well. And once they actually create these advertisements, it may, in most occasions, pretty rarely, but may have the name of the organization, but most commonly it'll just have the sector, the revenue count of hosts within the environment possibly might be there, and also any security defenses that the initial access broker could find when they land in the environment, such as like EDR if it's there, antivirus, things like that there. And most oftenly from what we see is they actually sell this access to ransomware operators or ransomware as a service. So one very prominent one is Keelan. That group's a huge buyer of access. They ask around for it all the time and sort of make these deals with them. But as far as Storm 0249, the previously known TTPs with them was phishing with malicious attachments to organizations, such as with like PDFs, QR codes, and then fake software download websites. So like your SEO poisoning. And really the main end goal is to distribute malware onto a host, such as like BruteRetel, Bumblebee, and Latrodectus, and several other malware variants that were observed utilizing. And with that, they use that malware, compromise that first host, and then just set it up on eBay and just kind of auction it off really from there.
Yeah, it's a good introduction. I found interesting in this report that the APT is one of their main initial access methods is click fix, which also is consistent with what we see very commonly exploited against customer environments. I believe for the past few quarters now, it's been one of our top threats that we are seeing. So just to kind of give you a little perspective that this is one of the threat actors behind one of the major phishing tactics we see. So Hayden, what are their latest developments we've observed around Storm 0249?
Yeah, so like you said, first observing them utilizing ClickFix. So really with organizations that might not sound too crazy, you might even see those day to day just at home on your personal computers, you're browsing. I've actually seen it pop up sometimes, otherwise known as like the fake captchas and so forth. But that could actually end up leading to ransomware deployment. That access could be sitting there for several months and then a buyer could be found, and then suddenly you have ransomware being deployed within your environment. And from what we saw within this report specifically is with that click fix, it was actually utilizing curl, which pipes straight to PowerShell. So curl goes to a fake Microsoft domain, which the user copies, pastes, runs it. And then one thing that was kind of interesting is that domain actually has the PowerShell code just within it. So that gets outputted from curl, piped over to PowerShell, and just starts running it. So really no files are actually downloaded on it. So you don't have like a .ps1 like PowerShell file being downloaded. But the other scenario that will talk a little bit more in depth about that we observed was phishing with a malicious MSI file or a Microsoft installer file. And this includes again, a fake Microsoft or impersonate a Microsoft domain that the user actually navigates to. And with this execution chain, just to kind of add a definition to before we go into it, it'll include a malicious DLL. And what a DLL is known as dynamic link library. Essentially, it's just code and data that could be reused by other programs. And I would say just think of it like DLC for a video game. So you just have your main video game. And that DLL is just sort of another add-on that has more functions and features. So that MSI file that I mentioned earlier contains a Trojanized or a malicious DLL that impersonates a Sentinel-1 DLL, along with the legitimate Sentinel-1 executable, which is Sentinel Agent Worker.exe, and it places this in the app data roaming file path within the Windows machine, and it brings these together, which is known as DLL sideloading. And to expand on that a little bit there as well, there's DLL search order hijacking and DLL sideloading. DLL sideloading is just a form of DLL search order hijacking. And what that is when Windows is looking for a DLL within a host, it'll first look in the file path that executable is located in. So in this instance with DLL sideloading, it's commonly used for initial access where the threat actor includes that malicious DLL and that executable at the same time. And one thing that I kind of forgot to mention earlier is that executable, the Sentinel-1 agent, it's actually signed. It is the Sentinel-1 executable as well. It's signed, it's safe. It's just the regular process for it. And when that S1 executable launches, it loads that malicious DLL thinking that it is the normal safe one. Again, it searches that same folder first. It's located there, loads in the memory, and then it starts actually executing it and then making C2 outbound connections. So if you look at it within like EDR or within your logging, you'll see that these connections come straight from the Sentinel agent worker.exe file, which is again signed, safe. And it could kind of throw off response. It could kind of look a little weird. You might question it, maybe just kind of move on and just think, well, Sentinel-1's doing something weird right now. But again, it's actually running malicious code within it. And then from there with Storm 0249, that's where they'll actually begin performing that local enumeration on the host. Like I said earlier, where they may discover how many hosts are within the environment, what security tools are installed, they'll start running those commands and collecting that information to be able to make those advertisements.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see them utilizing that DLL sideloading and masquerade essentially as Sentinel-1's execution here. Very difficult to detect. And I also thought it was interesting too that some of the information that they are grabbing off the host includes the machine GUID, which, as we outline in the report, is a key component used for ransomware groups later for encryption, really suggesting the change from this just being an initial access broker to, at minimum, having some collaboration and incentivizing those ransomware groups to not only buy the credentials they're selling, but also to hit the ground running in a ransomware attack even faster because they have key information available to them.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic point with it. Like I said earlier, with their deals of other ransomware groups, it could show that this initial access broker could be working very closely or almost exclusively with those groups, which really shows like how much actually risk there is to this of having that access provided to your organization.
Yeah, it's a great call out. And I remember in our ransomware recruitment report, when I was doing the research for that, I remember seeing caveats by certain ransomware groups on their recruitment posts saying, if you don't have those penetration testing skills, we're still looking for initial access brokers. We're still looking for other people. So definitely some good collaboration there. Hayden, wrapping things up here, what can organizations do to protect themselves?
Yeah, definitely. So of course, we want to try to defend this from this as much as we can to be able to really defend left, even from this initial access. But like we're keep harping on is the threat that could kind of happen from this could really escalate to something that could encrypt, part of or maybe your entire organization's network. So it is very critical. So first off, really for sure is just enforcing strict application controls, especially on like those utilities. One thing that we actually call out in the report directly, the use of like PowerShell, curl, does every end user need these sort of utilities for everyday business use? And really what it is by limiting those utilities, is you're reducing that attack surface. And like we say in cybersecurity, risk is equal to likelihood times impact. So what you're doing is you're kind of lowering that likelihood aspect right there, and overall just reducing your risk from it. And kind of further harping on application controls. So with utilities such as like AppLocker, you could actually control the execution of DLLs within an environment as well. So you can enforce actual rules on them, such as what the publisher is from it, what the file hash is, if it's signed or not. And you could actually have a deny sort of exclusion from these being able to actually execute within the environment as well. And then another one that would correlate with the Microsoft impersonating domains is, as we know, attackers spin up new infrastructure constantly. So if you could add in any sort of security controls to be able to block connections to domains registered within like the last 30, 90 days or so, it's also very critical as well. That'll actually pay off tenfold as well, not just from this attack, but from other ones. It's just very, very common for infrastructure to be spun up. And last one, just to make sure that you're logging your command line events, such as like Windows Event ID 4688. What they'll provide you with is like visibility into those discovery actions being ran on the host. And then from there, we'll be able to have detections for those as well.
Those are some great recommendations. Definitely think they could help stop this threat. In closing, I do want to say thank you to Corey and Hayden for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and expertise. I want to say thank you to our listeners for spending your valuable time with us. As a reminder, there are links to all the articles we discussed in the link tree below. And if you are available on YouTube, we are currently publishing Shadow Talk on there as well. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcast platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk, your weekly cybersecurity news and threat research podcast made for practitioners by practitioners.